In 1807, the first white man would enter Spokane country. David Thompson, an explorer, mapmaker, fur trader, working for the Northwest Fur Trading Company, had arrived. He found most of the Spokanes to be friendly groups of people. Over the next 50 years, missionaries, priests, fur traders, and even gold seekers, if they followed tribal laws and customs, lived here in peace. Chief Garry became the most well-known by the whites, as he was the only one for many years to be able to speak English. As a boy, he was sent to Red River, Canada, to learn the white man's language and religion. His father, United Spokane, understood that if many more of this new race of people were coming, as visions announced, the ability to communicate and understand them would benefit his people. By the 1850s, Spokanes adopted a few of the white ways. Both the Catholic and Protestant religions were introduced and competed for tribal followers. They also took up the practice of turning the ground and planting grains. So productive were they that Chief Garry in 1854 would travel to Vancouver seeking a mill to grind Spokane crops. But tension was growing nearby as immigrant farmers and gold seekers were entering Indian lands. Without permission and with no communications between the two races, clouds of war began to form. By 1855, Governor Stevens held treaty councils, the largest being the Walla Walla Council, where the Yakama, Nez Perce, and Umatilla tribes each signed a treaty. However, Stevens had no ability to enforce the words in the agreement. Thus, warriors would get fired up as gold miners and settlers defied the treaties and trespassed on their lands. By the fall of 1855, the Yakama War broke out, quickly spreading to the Ties, Deschutes, Cayuse, Umatilla, Palouse, and other bands of the Columbia Basin. Yakama Chief Tshimakain gathered warriors and drove the soldiers off their lands. The same year, gun and cannon fire was heard on the Puget Sound. Chief Leschi of the Nisqually, who opposed the Medicine Creek Treaty, claimed the X on the paper was a forgery. A flame of his warriors was ignited, and they went to war. In 1858, the sign of war came to Spokane country. Colonel Steptoe was packing the guns that makes two sounds, the howitzer cannon, the big gun that to the tribes represented that soldiers came to fight. Time arose that it was these tribes' turn to defend their families and country. In the spring of 1858, 30 miles south of Spokane Falls, gunshots were fired. Spokanes, Coeur d'Alenes, Palouse, and Yakama, and smaller bands of the Columbia River, drove Colonel Steptoe out of the upper country and back to Walla Walla. These gunshots officially drew the once peaceful Spokanes into the wars on the plateau. Upon returning back to safety, one of Steptoe's ranks would write,
"It will take 1,000 men to go into the Spokane country."
The previously deaf ears of Congress and the President were now open. The congressional enticement of 320 acres to every man that went west and claimed Indian lands had ignited a fire. Congress responded by giving appropriations and demanding military action. Soldiers and the new 1858 Springfield repeating rifle was their answer. Soon after the Spokane battle, Special Indian Agent John Owen traveled from the Flathead Agency of Montana to the Colville Valley to hold a council of the Spokanes and Colvilles, hoping to quiet the tribes and report to Superintendent of Indian Affairs Nesmith on the state of affairs in the area.
The Indians told me they had nothing against me as a private individual. They would have had no objection to Colonel Steptoe's passing up through their country with their small arms, but it was the cannon that alarmed them.
Chief Garry, throughout the years, even at the risk of his own life, continued to present peace as an alternative to war. Owens reported back,
"War or peace is still in their hearts. They want to know what was in Steptoe's heart. If he wants peace, he can have it. If he wants war, they will accommodate him."
As Owens left the Colville Valley, he was sure to send a warning to Nesmith.
Nothing but the war cry day and night. From one end of the valley to the other is heard.
Next, he traveled to Spokane Falls. Here, many more Spokanes, Coeur d'Alenes, and other Columbia tribal leaders were gathered. On July 16, 1858, Owens reported,
"I have just returned from one of the blackest councils, I think, that has ever been held on the Pacific slope. 500 fighting men were present, elated with their recent success. The dragoon horses were prancing around all day, the scalp and war dance going on all night long.
Warriors stood fast on the position of defending their family and country, even at the event of death.
Steptoe, Tastem cracks witchem, Leao was Rosalia, named Coeur, Jerusalem.
Gary and other cool-headed chiefs reasserted the idea of peace to Owen.
What troop me, because Camelsi, Steptoe. Hawkwet schoolstums, Yala Sachleets. Tunashay, Nemka Zutelt, Tulchenemka et Schil. Nemka Jilpacham, Lustentels. Rina Nemka and Camelsum.
On July 4th, 1858, the United States sent Colonel George Wright into the battlefield. Soldiers would be ordered from California and Arizona to join those coming from Fort Vancouver and Fort Simcoe. The largest military buildup seen in the Pacific Northwest was now here. These soldiers were no longer carrying muskets. They now were armed with the new Springfield 1855 repeating rifles, with accuracy of up to 500 yards and able to fire 10 rounds per minute. As Wright prepared to march, Nez Perce scouts arrived. The hostile Indians made a league of themselves and prepared to carry on this war for 5 years. Father Josette was reported to say the Coeur d'Alenes could carry on a 5-year war, attacking and falling back into their mountains and living off the land. Indian Affairs Superintendent Nesmith would write, "The tribes to the north considered this to be the last struggle in which they will have to engage, as in that time they feel they can exterminate the whites." On August 23rd and 24th, Wright's military force was stalled as the high winds and lashing rains beat down on the soldiers as they prepared to cross the Snake River. On August 27th, Spokane scouts overlooked the valley, and they would see a military force of 900 men crossing the Snake River. The warriors reported back. There were so many, it took 2 days for them to cross. The force consisted of 180 dragoons, 400 infantry, 90 in the rifle brigade, 30 Nez Perce scouts, and all followed by 200 Mexican skinners driving 400 mules, extra pack horses, and cattle. Scouts also reported that the soldiers were not following the route of Steptoe, but they were on the main trail headed straight toward Spokane Falls. Lawrence Kipp would write in his journal,
"Today we left the river. We had reveille at 3:30 in the morning and marched at 5. We made 15 miles and encamped on the Palouse River."
The once peaceful Spokane Indians, drawn into a conflict by shots fired by others, were now preparing for an all-out war. On August 30th, Lawrence Kipp wrote,
"Today we first saw the Indians in any force. We had just gone into camp when 2 of the Nez Perces rode in, announcing that a large body of Spokanes were approaching.
In the distance, gunshots were heard as warriors and the dragoons that rode out exchanged gunfire. The next day, August 31st, just past Cow Creek, Wright and his troops would see bands of warriors on the skyline. The united tribes would choose the ground which to fight. 4 lakes would be the place. Lakes and hilltops to be used as confines was the strategy. From these hilltops, they could see the clouds of soldiers' dust getting closer. Maybe for a brief instance, the evening before the fight, warriors would think of all the things they were fighting for. 15,000 years of existence along the Spokane River. Fishing sites that fed thousands of people for thousands of years. Family and a traditional way of life. Their beautiful river valleys where children could flourish. A semi-nomadic life with beautiful rivers, plains, and mountains to hunt, gather, and fish. On September 1st, 1858, the time came for Spokane and warriors from the Coeur d'Alene, Palouse, and Yakama to protect women and children and their country. Colonel George Wright was not here to talk, only to retaliate, to punish all those he thought needed to feel the full strength of the military soldiers. Lieutenant Kipp would report what he saw.
We found the Indians, increased in number, still posted on the hills overlooking us. One of the main hills that a big body of Indians rode overlooked the lakes below.
Colonel Wright would give orders to take the hill. Horse soldiers and infantry charged. Gun blasts, cannon bursts began from the left. Captain John Mullen and the Nez Perce ascended from the right. The main column of riflemen and artillery advanced up the center. Warriors and their bows, arrows, and muskets fought hard, but the cannon and long-range rifles dislodged them from the hill. Colonel Wright reported,
On reaching the crest of the hill, I saw at once that the Indians were determined to measure their strength with us, showing no disposition to avoid a combat.
Major Greer reported that the Indians were collected in large numbers. About 500 was thought at the foot of the hill and ready to fight. Wright described,
In front of us lay 400 mounted warriors, rushing to and fro, wild with excitement, eager for the fray.
It became apparent to the tribes the military had new weapons, the Springfield 1858 rifle that had never been felt before, having success at a range of up to 500 yards. The tribe planned to set a blaze to the area around the soldiers, but the rains earlier in the week didn't allow this tactic to be used today. Lieutenant Kip, from the top of the hill, looked south, back from where they just came. He saw Steptoe Butte in the skyline. Looking forward, he described the scene.
We rode to the top of the hill, when the whole scene lay before us like a splendid panorama. Below us lay 4 lakes, a large one at the foot of the hill on which we were, and just beyond it, 3 smaller ones.
Kip added,
On the plain below us we saw the enemy. Every spot seemed alive with the wild warriors we had come so far to meet. They were in the pines on the edge of the lakes, in the ravines and gullies on the opposite hillsides, and swarming over the plain. They seemed to cover the country for some 2 miles. Mounted on their fleet, hardy horses, the crowd swayed back and forth, brandishing their weapons, shouting their war cries, and keeping up a song of defiance.
Words spoken 45 days earlier along the Spokane Falls would be unfolding as chiefs and warriors willing to fight to the death to save 15,000 years of culture, tradition, and their women and children and lands that they had known forever. It will be dark, too dark to see. Father and son will fall together. The fight would be reported in Kip's journals.
The Indians acted as skirmishers, advancing rapidly and delivering their fire, and then retreating again with quickness and with irregularity, which rendered it difficult to reach them. They were wheeling and dashing about, always on the run.
All around, rifle fire and cannon blasts and reports could be heard through the smoke and dust of the charging horses. The tribes had designed a plan to lure the soldiers into the pine forest, where they would improve the advantage, but the soldiers' horses played out by that time, and with no breath left, had to return to their camp. Dusk began to fall. The Battle of 4 Lakes was over. The total area of fighting covered about 4 miles. Soldiers returned to Wright's camp, and the Indians returned to Spokane Falls to talk to their chiefs about the day. The soldiers had a new weapon. Tomorrow's tactics would need to be different. Of the day, Kip would write,
Owing to the long-range rifles now first used by our troops, had the men been armed with those formerly used, the result of the fight, as to the loss on our side, would have been far different, for the enemy had all the courage which we are accustomed to ascribe to Indian warriors.
For the next 3 days, Colonel Wright remained at 4 Lakes, as the soldiers and horses desperately needed rest. Nez Perce scouts reported back that there were no warriors in sight. They were gathered in war council at Spokane Falls. Wright would order any lodges and caches of winter supplies of the tribes to be burned and destroyed. On September 5th, soldiers would begin their march toward the infamous Spokane Falls. Kip would report,
After marching about 5 miles, we saw the enemy collecting in large bodies on our right. They rode along parallel to us for some time, all the while increasing in numbers and becoming bolder.
The soldiers' 4-day rest would allow the grasses of the Spokane Plains to dry. The tribe's plan was to set a fire to the plain to scatter the soldiers' horses and pack train, using its smoke for cover, aiding them to get nearer to their enemy, making the musket fire to be in range. Immense bravery was needed now more than ever. A running battle would begin. Tribal warriors who, since they were children, learned to ride horseback, becoming great horsemen, were seen in the skyline. Kip would report,
Then, on the hills to our right, if we could have had time to have witnessed them, were feats of horsemanship which we have never seen equaled. The Indians would dash down a hill 500 feet high and with a slope of 45 degrees at the most headlong speed, apparently with all the rapidity they could have used on level ground.
The grasses had dried. The Indians lit the ground afire. Colonel Wright described in his report,
We were nearly enveloped by flames.
Fortunately for Wright, the grasses did not burn as violently as they would have if ignited a few weeks earlier. The Mexican mule skinners that aided Wright were of some of the best the military had seen, keeping control of the 200 mules and extra soldiers' horses. Smoke, dust, shouting mule skinners, warriors calling out the war cries, at times overcome by rapid gun blasts covering the plains. Unlike the Four Lakes battle, this would be a running battle, with smoke and gunfire everywhere, all along the path of the battle. When the fire on the plains was over, the tribes began to draw the soldiers towards Deep Creek, to use the tribes as cover. It would be a cannon shot that burst a tree that would wound Yakama war chief Tshimakain in the head. As the soldiers continued towards Deep Creek, tribes continued to fight. Groups of tribesmen gathered and united in the woods, surrounding the soldiers, exchanging gunfire.
A heavy body of Indians had concentrated on our left, when our whole line moved quickly forward and the firing became general throughout the front.
The fight wore on for 7 hours and over 14 miles, until the soldiers reached the Spokane River. Here they would camp at night. In the distance, they would see many campfires of various tribes.
We again had a proof of the efficiency of the new rifles. We discovered some of the hostile Nez Perce were united with the enemy in this fight. After dark, we saw their campfires in the distance.
September 7th, Kip would report.
We broke camp, hearing that the enemy were in force above the Kettle Falls. Moved up the river about 7 miles when we encamped again. Most of the way through the woods skirting the river, the scenery around being very beautiful. We passed the Great Spokane Falls. As high up as the falls, salmon were found in great abundance.
3 miles above the falls, Chief Gary would express he wanted to talk. They would meet at the ford, 2 miles above the falls. Gary went into Wright's camp. Wright delivered this message.
I did not come into the country to ask you to make peace. I came here to fight. Now, when you are tired of war and ask for peace, I will tell you what you must do. You must come to me with your arms, with your women and your children and everything you have, and lay them at my feet. If you do not do this, war will be made on you this year and next, and until your nations shall be terminated.
Wright demanded to know where Tshimakain and his brother Shroom were. He also wanted to know the whereabouts of Qualchin and his father Auhai. These were known war leaders, and were on Wright's list to be punished. The son of Spokane Chief Big Star would enter Wright's camp in the name of his father. The soldiers would take his guns. These were marked London, 1847, coming from the Hudson Bay post near Kettle Falls. Other warriors too would enter Wright's camp. These would be taken prisoner. Unknowingly to Wright, one of these was Chief Palouse, whose daughter was married to Qualchin. It was probably this union that helped draw the lower Spokanes into the fight. At this camp, Wright would have a Spokane warrior hung. Joe Hutt was hung without trial. Suspicion alone was enough for Wright. Joe Hutt was not known to ever be in the battle. On September 8th, soldiers would continue their march. After about 10 miles, they would see clouds of dust on the nearby hills. Soldiers readied again for battle. Scouts reported back the clouds were coming from large herds of horses. Wright sent out to have the horses captured. All along the way, orders to burn lodges, caches filled with winter supplies, grains, fish, roots, and berries, and anything the tribe might need. Sergeant Keyes would write, "Desolation marked our tracks." Wright's stance was if they could not kill the warriors, he would starve their families. From the opposite side of the river, Palaus's sons approached, seeking their father's release. Soldiers fired upon them, wounding them both and killing one of their horses. Wright now became aware of Palaus's standing. By September 9th, 900 horses had been captured and placed in a makeshift pen along the Spokane River, near the Washington-Idaho state line. 130 of these were selected to be used for the trip back to Walla Walla, which later were killed as they relentlessly tried to get away from their captives to return to their owners. Wright, to cripple the Indians further, ordered the remaining 670 horses killed. At first it was one by one, lassoed, drug out, and then shot. 270 were killed in this fashion, colts and fillies, crying out for their mothers until they were knocked in the head with a mallet. As night fell, mares cried out for their young, foals whinnied for their dead mothers. Sounds of distress was heard all night long. The next morning, it was determined the process was taking too long. Wright gave orders for troops of men to fire volleys of shots into the herd, at times only to wound them, breaking a leg or bursting a rib. Wright marched towards Cataldo, continuing his devastating actions. A veteran soldier who gave an interview in 1905 identified at least 27 Indians that were hung along the way back to Walla Walla. A rotometer, a two-wheel cart, at times was used as a hangman's platform. At Cataldo, Father Josette had the Coeur d'Alenes gathered or waiting nearby to meet with George Wright. Here, Wright would deliver his peace terms, and on September 23, 1858, the Coeur d'Alenes would sign a peace treaty. Wright then turned his troops back towards Walla Walla. Father Josette, aiding him, gathered many Spokanes that were to wait for him where the westerly trail crossed the creek that ran through the root fields and back to the Spokane River. It would be here that Chief Auhai would be taken into custody and placed in irons. Wright would send Gary out to find Qualchin, to tell him if he did not come in, his father would be hung. Gary was unable to find Qualchin, but later on his own accord, he, his wife, and two other men came into the little valley where Wright and the military force were camped. Qualchin was quickly taken prisoner. Without trial or questioning, within 15 minutes of him entering camp, he was hung. Here other warriors were hung also, 6 on one specific site. One of those sang a song, which today is still alive, carried forward from generation to generation by the drum groups, telling the story of its origination, used at times of honor. Old Chief Auhai, hands were shackled to each other, his feet were shackled under the belly of his horse. During the trip back, Lieutenant Morgan, who was assigned to care for Auhai, tired of this duty. As Sergeant Ball, who was later blamed for some of the Steptoe's defeat, as he lessened the load of ammunition to make room for whiskey, approached on the opposite side of the chief and ordered Morgan to shoot the old chief, which he did 3 times. Quickly, the Indian history of the Pacific Northwest became hidden in the archives of the United States, never to be taught or discussed. Some of those who were taken prisoner and hung without trial had never played a role in the battles or taken up arms against the soldiers. John Mullen, a military engineer who planned out the infamous Mullen Trail, led the 30 Nez Perce Scouts during Wright's campaign. While in camp, after the Four Lakes battle, he wrote,
"The Indian history of this region is different from that of any in any other quarter of the country. The country was thrown open to settlement before any preparation was made, before Indian title was extinguished, and hence alone, in my judgment, the cause for most of the Indian troubles in this region. There are but 2 alternatives left to us in this region. The past confirms it, and the present still further strengthens it. The one is a well-adjusted, prudent peace policy carried out by men alive and equal to their duties, honest to the Indian and the department, and who fill positions neither for position or gain's sake. The other is the force of arms vigorously applied."
This song came down from when George Wright hung these Indians up Hangman Creek, or they call Leta Creek, in 1858. And this was supposedly one of the people that he hung. There was their death song, and it's been passed down since then. And that was told us by the elders that I used to drum with.